Okay, hello guys. Hope you guys like my trout. I don't know if you guys noticed, but I have the same thing on my shirt. When you are more commonly known by a pseudonym than your actual name, you have to do things like this so that people can point you out. Yeah, I should stick on the title. So this talk is about extending browser applications. And I'm going to start with talking about what I mean by that and why would someone want to do this. So here's the general idea that I'm talking about when I say extending browser applications. And the idea is to take someone else's browser application, or it could be yourself if you're a different department or whatever, add features to it, and then redistribute it. You've probably seen extensions for Chrome and stuff that have this kind of functionality. The one I want to give as an example here is the Reddit enhancement suite. This is a really popular extension. Many power users of the Reddit website use this. It adds tons of awesome features. It's very well supported. I highly recommend it if you use Reddit. The feature I really like that it adds is, this is Reddit RA, by the way, which is like probably the best part of Reddit. It just is cute animals. And what it does here is, that blue arrow is pointing at a paw mark. And if you click that paw mark, it actually expands the image inline. Now, by default on Reddit, the way they work with links, even though Reddit is like ostensibly a message board, is that when you click on a link, it takes you to another tab or it sends you away and you lose your context. The Reddit enhancement suite allows you to just stay right there and not lose your place. You can also say expand all images and stuff like that. This is just one example of many features that they have, but I think it's really cool. But if you want to take a peek at the source code and see like how this is implemented, this is a small screenshot of their GitHub. I'm going to underline some things here. This is the way they actually augment websites. And by the way, like, this is not a slight against the developers of the Reddit enhancement suite. It's just like this is how it's commonly done. They have selectors. They use document.getElementById. They use query selector and stuff like that. So it's back to this, like, these days of the jQuery selector-based programming where you're just like, find this item on the screen, insert a button, make it work. One thing I should have underlined but didn't is that the way it checks to see what page it should add things onto is a test against the location.href, which you can see is the top bit there. So when I look at code like this, like, I have a pretty visceral reaction. You know, it's something like this. But programming.gif. I also send this to, like, whenever my friends and family say, like, what is it you do all day? I'm like, this is the best explanation. So yeah, so it's using selectors and IDs and stuff like that, and it's testing the URL. And like an obvious downside to this that you're probably already thinking of is what happens if Reddit's markup changes? Well, the answer is Reddit enhancement suite breaks, and that's really, really awful. So I'm going to posit a few questions here, I guess. What if you wanted to extend a website and you didn't have to depend on selectors? What if the application was built, say, using an ambitious web framework? We could call the JavaScript directly. So I'm going to show an example here on the website that I work on, which is Discourse, open source forum software. And, oh, I should have actually been logged in. So I actually screwed up this because I had to switch laptops, so I apologize. But what you can actually do here is, such momentum lost. Discourse has, like any web application, I can just show you can type commands in the console. So like if I say discourse.user.current, I get a handle on the current user. Now in this case it's null because I'm not logged in, and I can't actually log in because it's Google two-factor authentication and I'm not using my own laptop. But the idea here is if I got a handle on the user using discourse.user.current, I could then say .set name, and immediately this would be changed everywhere across the application. Now, if you're used to doing web development using something like Ember or Angular, like this isn't magic, but what I'm actually trying to show here is that it's really cool that we have essentially a front-end API as well as a back-end API. And if you programmed an extension or something against that, it wouldn't have to be based on selectors. So this is like what I call a positive side effect. When I was discussing the advantages of Ember.js when I first started using it, I was like, you get a server-side API for free. Because if you don't have a server-side API, your front-end browser application just doesn't work. But there's a second side effect, and that's that you get a client-side API for free. And this is something that's like kind of an interesting thing that I've been thinking about recently because people have been developing plugins for discourse and stuff like that. But it's like, if we're big fans of exposing server-side APIs, why are we not also thinking of client-side APIs? I think like many people I've discussed this with are like, well, I just don't see the advantage. I see the reason on discourse because people could read a plugin, but why would anyone want to build on my website? But it's actually, you're kind of saying the same thing that people said about server-side APIs. If you expose this kind of stuff or get it for mostly free from Ember, people will and can build stuff on this, especially if your website reaches any level of popularity, such as Reddit. Now, of course, it comes with some caveats. If your client-side API changes, your extension can break. Now, anecdotally, for what it's worth, I think this happens a lot less than with jQuery selectors. If you look at most of Discourse's code from a year ago, it still holds up today. If you look at our markup, that's not true. And I don't know those Reddit Enhancement Suite guys, but I strongly suspect that if you ask them, would you prefer a website built with something like Ember to build their extension suite on top of, they would say absolutely in a second. So I want to go through some techniques of like how you can make your application more extensible, or like that you can build on top of an Ember application that's already running. This stuff isn't totally useless if you feel like you're never going to do this, because I think some of these techniques are actually just cool ways to build an application. So the first thing I suggest in terms of like extending stuff is use Ember's internals. So Ember has this great object model. And as we looked at before, you can call reopen on any class. So in this example, I have a user, app.user, and I'm calling reopen, and I'm adding a computed property. The cool thing is here, I didn't declare app.user. You assume that this was already instantiated somewhere else. Someone built this API for me. All I'm doing is jumping in and saying, I want to have scream name. And then, as you can see in the bottom example there, when you call fish.get scream name, you get the version that's screaming. That's pretty simple. I should note, we've discussing it a lot, but I feel like we really should drill this in that all new Ember applications should be using ES6 modules and transpilation. Ember CLI does this by default. It is awesome. I can't recommend it enough, so please do it. But you might be thinking, if I'm using ES6 modules, how could I possibly say app.user? Is there a way to access that so that it can be extended? And the truth is, Ember does come with an awesome way to do this, the initializers. So usually if you're extending an application, you want to do it when the application is booting up. You want to add external things to objects that are already in play. And Ember's initializers are a great way to do this. Cool thing about initializers is you can have as many as you want. You can specify an after property to an initializer so that a load order is preserved. And Ember will figure out all the dependencies and stuff like that for you. So here's a really simple example, similar to what I was showing you before, where I've created an initializer. I've given it a name. I like to call it the same name as the file that it's declared in. And then I say user equals container.lookupFactory model:user, user.reopen. So that's not much code, but if you haven't looked at the container before, you might be like, well, WTF was that? The container is the structure that Ember uses to manage all the objects and classes that it uses. And you can also query it for stuff. Normally, most of the time, like we saw in previous presentations, Ember will do this for you. If you access a URL by a certain name, the router will eventually trigger a series of events that will query it. But it has two cool methods that you can call. One is lookup, and that finds an instance of an object, and lookupFactory, which would find a class for you. So this is probably better shown as an example. So if in an initializer, and by the way, initializers are passed the container as a parameter, you can say container.lookup, controller:topic, and that says, I want the currently used topic controller. In an Ember application, of course, controllers are usually singletons. Unless they're like an item controller, there's just one of them at play at any time. If you wanted the class to instantiate something, such as a model for a user, you can say lookupFactory. So it's super simple, and then you can use the ES6 syntax and not have to worry about stuff. But an interesting question that you might have asked yourself if you've never seen the container before is, how does Ember know what to return? Like, if you do say topic controller, Ember knows how to get that, but what mechanism is it using internally to determine that? And it's using something called the resolver. And the resolver is essentially that. It's something that takes a string query for an object and then returns that object or class. But the really cool thing about this is you can supply your own resolver. So why would you do this? Why is this cool? Well, the idea is like anytime someone asks for something, you can actually overwrite that and give them something else instead. And I think this is a really great way to extend applications because you can plug in your own components as needed. So here's an example of a custom resolver I wrote called Awesome Resolver. And it just extends Ember's default resolver, as you can see. And I've overridden the resolve template method. So what this is actually doing is when you're asking for a template anywhere in your app, what it's first doing is it's appending the name awesome / and then it's looking for the template with that name. So the idea here is that you can say in your application, like let's say you're extending someone else's application, like creating a Reddit enhancement suite, you could make a folder called awesome. And because of this custom resolver, it'll look into the awesome folder first and see if there's been an overridden template. If it finds it, it'll return that. If it doesn't, it'll then go back to the default behavior by calling this.super. So I think this is a really great pattern that you can use if you're thinking of extending something. In other words, look for your customized version or extended version, and if it does not exist, go back to the default behavior. So this is where you get the Spider-Man warning, which is with great power comes great responsibility. Just because you can swap any component out with another doesn't mean that you should. In fact, it could be really dangerous if someone wanted a user and you sent them a pet model back. So always try to do what I showed, which is try to use Ember's object model to extend things or new templates and then return those so that if they want something that looks like what they're using, they're going to get something that approximates that. Now, there's some downsides to this approach, in particular of the awesome template thing that I showed you, which is that often replacing the entire template is too much. We have, like, maybe your templates are just a couple lines of code, but like we often have some that are 20, 40 lines long. And what we find is that users who want to extend discourse using a method similar to this is that they just want to replace one little bit of the template. They don't want to replace that entire giant stuff. And in the cases where they have essentially copied and pasted so that they can get their work done, we found that it's limited our ability to refactor because in their version, they still use the old names for helpers and all sorts of stuff like that, and then we can't then safely rename a helper without introducing a deprecation warning. It's just kind of a mess. So some of our discourse users have, or contributors, I should say, have come up with some novel approaches to this. So one is called HACWL, I believe, is how it's pronounced. And I actually think this acronym is too short because it contains another acronym. And what it basically stands for is Handlebars Abstract Syntax Tree Query Language. And it's as crazy as it sounds. It's essentially this idea that it uses the Handlebars abstract syntax tree. And if you're not familiar what an abstract syntax tree is, it's the state after a template has been parsed into a series of objects. Those series of objects are usually represented as a tree so that a compiler or something else can use them and manipulate them and stuff like that. So this syntax right here, I'm going to highlight it, basically is saying I want to insert hello world into a template after the first if nested, the if else, and then the second if after that. Now, this actually works, believe it or not. But it's quite complicated. I thought it was like a super clever hack, and it was created by Discourse user Lightyear. And he uses it in a couple of his plugins, and I think some other people did too. But it was always just too complicated. And it also still kept us to kind of that same tree structure. Like it's a different kind of selector-based programming. It's selecting against the syntax tree instead of the markup. So it wasn't really useful. So we were thinking like, well, how can we allow people to just insert arbitrary markup into any template? And Ember has this really cool thing called container view. And you might not have ever used this because if you're just using the standard Ember each and collections and stuff like that, like this is mostly abstracted away from you. But a container view is a really cool thing. It's a view class, and it's like an array, so it can contain as many views as you want. But the cool thing is the views don't even have to be the same type. So we could do something like this. In our post handlebars here, I'm just showing a title for a post, and underneath I'm saying view post after title. And then in the post after title file, I'm just saying export default ember.containerview.extend. Now, if you ran this code, it would actually work, and it would show you nothing. So it didn't break the template, but it's also exposed an extension point. If we go back to our initializers, we can actually create a method here. Using the container, you can look up the factory for the post after title that we just created. And we can add a method on didInsertElement. This is the same syntax that we saw before, but this just means once we have an element in the DOM. And then we can call this.push object with a new view, and that view has a template. So if you put this in an initializer in an app, and that app has a container view, you're going to get that template rendered. That works really well. You get some advantages. Multiple plugins, because this has been a problem for us in the past, is if you're identifying extension points, what happens if two plugins want to insert in the same thing? Well, a container view allows multiple ones. I do think, though, it's a lot of boilerplate. Well, I added there by Ember standards because we're used to not writing a lot of code. And this seems like awfully specific. And just look at that initializer. That's a lot of code that's just saying I want to add this template at this point. So the question is there a way that we could do it cleaner? So we came up with this idea of a helper called plugin outlet. And the idea of a plugin outlet is that you could supply it with a name, and it's going to render a template into the plugin outlet by that name, and it's going to wire it up automatically. And the cool thing is that the context of the template is going to be the same thing as the enclosing, as its parent, or you'll see in a second. So how you would do this is we would take the post example, and instead we'd say plugin outlet, and we'd give it a string title. And then what we've done here in Discourse is we've said, if you create a folder called in templates called connectors, and then you give it the same directory structure as the plugin outlet title, any file that's in that folder will automatically be appended into your template at that spot. So the good news is, this isn't just a thought experiment. Like I said, we've added this to Discourse already, and it works really great. So if you're interested in the source code of this, or you want to use this in your project, it's available today on Discourse's GitHub. That is a live link that you can't click here because you can't reach out and touch the screen. But I'll make the slides available for download later. At some point, we might actually extract it into a Bower module or something like that. And pretty much all the templates that used to use the HAQL thing have been rewritten this way, and it actually works really great. So I wanted to talk about one other thing, about one common pattern that I've seen in some Ember apps. Maybe not common, maybe slightly uncommon, but it happens enough that it's a little annoying. And I think it's interesting because it's related to this plugin stuff, but it's also related to thinking against the way Ember does things. So here's a question I have for you. Have you ever had a view in an Ember application that you've wanted to communicate with another view? And when I say this, I don't necessarily mean a parent of that view or a child of that view, because in Ember that's actually not hard. You can say parent view or child views. But here's an example from Discourse of viewing a topic. And at the bottom is this thing here we call the composer. And that's in blue, and it's surrounded for your ease of viewing. And above it is something called the progress. So as you're scrolling, we use infinite scrolling. And as you scroll through a topic, those numbers increment, and you can click it and jump to different parts of the topic. The problem is you don't want that to be obscured by the composer, and the composer is resizable. So if you clicked on the top of the composer, there's a handle, and you can drag it to anywhere you want. The progress thing is also expected to move along with it. Now these are sibling views. In fact, the composer can appear on so many different pages of our site, such as sending a private message to a user, that it doesn't belong to a topic. It actually belongs higher up. It belongs, I believe, at the application template level. The progress thing actually belongs in a topic. So that's actually a little tricky in Ember. How do you send a message when the composer resizes to the progress thing to tell it to readjust its position? So I added this question mark here of the Ember way, because I'm actually not certain that anyone on the Ember core team would ever recommend you do it this way. But this is one way that I was able to use Ember's object model to access one view from another. So we know that the composer view has a composer controller, and the progress view has a progress controller. And we both know that within a view, we all know that within a view, you can say this.get controller to get access to that view's bound controller. And then we know that because controllers are singletons, you can say needs in one controller. So the composer controller can say, I need the progress controller. At this point, you can say, well, the progress view could observe something in the progress controller, and the composer view can set it in a really roundabout way. So I hope you guys can read that code, but it's really complicated. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, in the composer view, set controller.controllers.progress.resized@, and that's a new date get time. The reason I'm using a timestamp in this case is that the composer can be resized many times, and if we're going to be observing it, we need to observe whenever it changed. And then within progress view, we've created an observer that I'm just giving a method name here of observe resize, and I'm saying reposition whenever controller resized@ changes. Now, I actually think this is really hideous. Like, this is the kind of thing where like Ember has these guardrails. It like normally does not want you to reach from one view to another, and it does this for a reason, because it can lead to just code where you're just reaching out of your bounds. You're doing things willy-nilly. So like, what if we had a different solution? What if we could broadcast events within our application and then other things could listen for them? We could broadcast a composer resized event, for example. So just to be clear, I'm not talking about events that are coming from a server or anything like that. I'm talking about things that happen within the app that other parts of the app might want to know about. So Ember has this really cool mix-in that you might have used before. And it's actually used internally to handle all those cases like the on did insert element and stuff like that. But it's called Ember evented. And I have an example here where I'm creating a doughboy object, and I'm just saying Ember object create, and I'm mixing in Ember evented. And then you can say doughboy.on and give it an event name. So in this case, I'm saying poke, and whenever the doughboy is poked, he's going to console.log he, right? And then at the bottom or anywhere else in your code, you could say doughboy.trigger poke, and that'll just work. So the question is, how could you make this available in the rest of your application? Well, we've looked a little bit at dependency injection, and the first thing I'm going to say is, like, who says it's just for Angular? This stuff is actually in Ember, and you're able to use it. It's just exposed in a more, I think, rigid API. You can't. One thing you often see in Angular is that people are injecting the HTTP object into a directive, or just these cross-cutting concerns that you should never, ever do. But in Ember, you have to explicitly say what can be shared where. So what if we just injected Ember invented into things that we want to use? Then we could trigger events, and we could watch for those events. So this is actually very little code. Here's another initializer. And I'm registering an object called appEventsMain. And creating that object is just the same Ember object extend thing that I showed you before. And I'm saying it's a singleton. I only want one of these things. And then I'm going to say, let's make it available in controllers, routes, views, and models. Now, you could be more rigid, like I said, and say, I only want this available in views by just leaving in the view line. But essentially, it's as simple as it looks. You just say inject into what thing, what do you want to call the variable, and what registered thing in the container do we want to put in there. That's all we had to do. At this point, it's then simple enough to then go into our composer view and say this.appEvents.trigger with an event name as a string. And then our progress view, we can then say on resize reposition. And then we don't have to worry about reaching throughout the object model or anything like that. We just broadcast the events. This has, I think, the same Spider-Man warning as before, is that if you're doing this, you're going against Ember's way of doing things. And I think sometimes that's OK, as long as you have a good reason. If your approach, I think, means that you don't have to write a lot of code or do a lot of ugly things, or in your opinion, ugly, that's probably OK. I would hesitate going against Ember's guardrails if you just think you know better than Ember and you're like, oh, I could do that better, and blah, 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 blah. Like, you should strongly consider why their conventions exist. But once in a while, it's OK to break it. I would definitely use it sparingly. And if you're using this model a lot, this event broadcasting model, I would consider why. So this is just like the tip of the iceberg for like how you can extend a live Ember app. Like, these are just some I think very simple abstractions that you could use to make your life easier if you're exposing a client-side API. And if there's one message I want you to take away from this, like besides like, hey, you could use these free tools, just look at the Discord source code, is that you should consider offering a client-side API for your project. You should make it easier for people to extend your application. And finally, like, I have to say, like, most of the stuff I showed you was like under a dozen lines of code. And I think that's a testament to Ember as a framework, is that Ember might be a lot larger than some other frameworks, but the toolbox is so immense and so powerful that it enables you to do these really awesome patterns without writing very much code. So Thanks a lot. If you liked what I said, you can follow me, Evil Trout, on Twitter. I have a blog. I write about Ember a lot. Lately, I'm doing some screencasts. That's at eviltrout.com, or don't. I'm not going to tell you what to do. So thanks a lot.
When you're cautioning us about injecting events, if we're the app developers, though, if we're creating an API that people can write extensions on, is there any reason not to just emit a lot of events in our app as a way to provide hooks for extending on?
Well, I think that actually is a good thing to do. I would hesitate to just throw every event that you could possibly think of under the sun. What we've been doing, and we have the luxury that we have a fair amount of people building stuff on top of Discourse already, so they're like, we need this extension point. So we say, well, the first question is like, well, why? And then look at their use case and see if it makes sense. But I think you can, a lot of the time, come up with a clever, like, you can probably estimate someone's going to want to know when this thing happens, and if that's the case, do it. But I wouldn't make like every second line of your code. I mean, you probably weren't suggesting that anyway, were you?
When you talk about like having an API, like client-side API, when I think API, I think about how am I going to version it? How would you version that client?
That's a really good question, actually. So the question was, how would you version the client-side API? That is, I don't know. I wish I had a better answer for that. Like I said, I think, I guess I kind of talked about this in the slide. I consider it a much better approach than the Reddit enhancement suite thing, which is based on selectors, but it doesn't fully solve the problem, right? Like, I think it's a lot better and a lot more extendable, but there are problems where when your client-side API changes, what do you do? Maybe someone else here has a really great idea. I can think of a few off the top of my head. Like you put it in modules that you let other people use, and that is versioned. What? We've actually had this happen recently where rather than a version, we just deprecate certain parts of Discourse, like certain helper names. So if you use that helper name, you get a big warning. The app still works and translates the old helper, but probably by version 1, we're just going to rip that out, and it's the plugin author's responsibility, for now at least, to stay on top. Please don't hate us.
Have you thought about versioning Discourses? You might have an internal version number for Discourse. Have you thought about that version being aligned with like a break for authors? So for example, some Discourse 2.0 you won't break APIs. Is that something you consider?
So the question is, in case you guys couldn't hear, is Discourse has a version number itself as a software product. Would we consider saying this API on the client side is good until version 2.0 of Discourse or whatever? That's a great idea. I think we might do something like that. There are a lot of people writing plugins, and we're taking it more seriously. That's kind of where this presentation came from. But I also think that we have a lot to learn ourselves, and that's probably a good path to take as we make it more rigid. That's a question.
When you're going to use a lot of events to be listening to and triggering, how would you recommend preventing it getting too complicated in the Ember run loop and sort of transactions that happen that are asynchronous? I mean, that could turn into, families of sort of rat's nest.
Oh, right. Like you could ping pong. Like this event could then cause this event, which could go back to this event, something like that.
Or just some developer, grabs some event that's supposed to be triggering something, and they don't necessarily make it so that they're waiting for a save to come back from, an asynchronous call, and a transition to another page happens by the same event.
I would be
something. I don't know.
I think I would be really concerned if there was an event that was like happened on save before the save committed or something like that. Like if you're building your site and exposing these events for other people to use, I feel strongly that you shouldn't expose events that could lead to programmer difficulty. Like those should be different APIs, something like a save post rather than wait for a save and then. Like the last thing you want to do is, even though you can send messages back and forth with events all the time, you don't want to be building a complex like packet-based almost thing where you're like send that here and then wait for reply and then like handshake. Like if you've done that, you've done it wrong. I think you have to. It's about being simple and establishing these points where you're like, like if you saw in my example there, and I'm going to try and keep it to this, is that the composer resize event didn't even pass any data. It was just like, this has happened. And then the cool thing about the DOM is that the progress view, inside that there's a little bit of like DOM inspection that said, where is the other thing? And it can look at where it has to position itself. I feel like that's a lot better than sending these messages constantly back and forth that have data. So I think that's one approach to avoid that situation. But yeah, I really hope it never gets to that point.
Anybody else? All right, thank
Cool.
you, Robin.
Thanks a lot.